So today I wanted to take a look at this little guy right here, the Modretro Chromatic. Now I've spent about a month with this system so far, but I gotta be honest, the first time I saw this, I completely ignored it. But that's not really my fault, because the first time I saw it, I didn't really register that I had seen it, because the only time I'd actually seen these things out in the wild was at my local GameStop, and where they put it was kind of in this glass case right alongside a bunch of sort of cheap retro emulation machines, which aren't necessarily bad machines, right? I mean, I don't hate the Retron 5 or anything like that, but it wasn't something I'd really seen before. But then it kind of caught my eye because I saw that this system was showing for $199, which seemed pretty steep for what I thought was a cheap Game Boy knockoff. But this is definitely not a cheap Game Boy knockoff. And after having spent a little over a month with this system so far, I don't think I would say it is the best way to play Game Boy games, but it might be the most authentic, and in a way it's sort of the Dark Souls of Game Boys, but we'll revisit that in a little bit. So today I just wanted to go over what this device actually is, what you can expect from the experience, some of the things I like, some of the things I'm not so fond of, and then some final thoughts overall. But for now, let's just go ahead and talk about the hardware for the Modretro Chromatic, because I have to say, this is unlike any build quality I've seen in pretty much any portable gaming device. At its core, the Modretro Chromatic is an FPGA hardware device that aims to recreate the Game Boy Color experience as accurately as possible. Now, notice I said Game Boy Color and not Game Boy Advance, because this thing does not accept Game Boy Advance cartridges, just original Game Boy Color, and also Modretro Chromatic cartridges, but we'll get to those in a little bit. The exterior shell is actually made of a magnesium alloy, and combined with the fact that this thing takes 3 AA batteries or a rechargeable power core once those finally come back in stock, means it's a pretty beefy unit in the hand. It's not uncomfortably heavy, but you will definitely notice the weight. Also, I should point out that the texture on that particular material that they've used for the exterior of the device is really quite bizarre. It's not quite metal, but it's not quite plastic. It feels like it's someplace in between, but it definitely feels nice in hand and somehow both smooth and kind of grippy. It's a very strange material that's really hard to describe unless you've actually had some hands-on time with it. And weirdly enough, to kind of give you an idea of just how serious the material in this is, you can kind of hear it if you tap the battery compartment against the shell. That's a very odd sound to hear on a portable gaming device. Normally I would expect something plastic or just straight up aluminum, but yeah, this middle ground material really is bizarre and I really like it. And listen to that click. Solid. And that build quality from the shell extends to the buttons as well. Because it is basically a Game Boy Color for all intents and purposes, it has the same buttons there that you would expect. A very commanding D-pad, A, B, start and select, an oversized analog volume wheel on the side for a single downward firing speaker which sounds really loud. Here, take a listen. Kirby never disappoints. And just underneath that volume wheel, you've got a menu button so you can control all of the system level functions, and then up top you've got a beefy oversized power switch, which really does feel satisfying to click. Here, take a listen. It's excellent. Also at the bottom of the device, you do have a 3.5mm headphone jack, and then also a USB-C port, which can be used to power the device off of an AC outlet. It can be used for data transfer to update both cartridges and the system firmware itself, but for my purposes in particular, I love that USB-C port also allows you to do a native video output while you play the Modretro Chromatic, so if you're somebody who streams Game Boy games or needs to capture footage for videos on a regular basis like I do, that is an incredibly cool feature to have. And considering it is replicating the functionality of the original Game Boy Color, it does have a link port as well on the left, and then an IR port up top. And then of course it has a cartridge slot, which... perfect. But the real star of the show, depending on your perspective, is the Modretro Chromatic screen, which is a true 160 by 144 LCD that they built specifically for this purpose. Which means there's no upscaling wizardry at work here or anything. This is, for all intents and purposes, the original Game Boy Color screen as you remember it, kind of warts and all, because depending on your perspective, you may not love this look, but if you do want an authentic look at what the Game Boy screen used to look like from that era, this is pretty amazing. Now, as far as what it feels like to actually use and engage with this device on a regular basis, like I already mentioned, the material on the outside feels very pleasing in hand. Now, when it comes to the A and B buttons, which are probably the ones that you'll be most likely to interact with on a regular basis, they are incredibly clicky, and I would say almost too clicky, because they are very loud. Now, if you're wearing headphones or something like that, it's probably not going to be as big of a deal, but I might actually look into swapping out the membranes underneath these buttons at some point, which should be easier thanks to the Modretro Chromatic mod kit, which they sell for like 15 bucks, which comes with an entire array of replaceable button colors if you just want to crack it open and change things out. And I believe it also has 2 different sets of membranes, one that's a little bit firmer and one that's a little bit softer depending on your taste, but honestly, despite the fact that the buttons are very clicky for A and B, everything on this feels completely rock solid. At no point did I ever press one of these buttons and wonder if it had registered correctly. Now, going back to the display for a second, I know I said it was a very authentic experience, that 160 by 144 resolution, but that may not be your desired way to play Game Boy games, and I think that would be completely understandable. Because no, it's not ultra high resolution like the Analog Pocket or anything like that, and its more muted color palette, which is pretty reflective of the way games look back on the original Game Boy Color, is definitely accurate, but if you prefer like a warmer look or something like that, or more flexibility with how you fine-tune how those images are going to appear, it may not perfectly appeal to you. But if you want something that's going to as closely mirror that original experience as possible, especially if you have any nostalgia for it and kind of grew up on systems like this, it definitely feels like they put a lot of thought into it, and that kind of commitment to authenticity definitely spoke to me. And while we're on the subject of authenticity, even though there are a lot of nice features included with the Modretro Chromatic, save states are not one of them. So if you got spoiled on that by the Analog Pocket like I have, it may be a little bit jarring to go back to an experience where they don't really sand down that difficulty at all, and it really does, for better or worse, maintain that sort of purity of the retro experience, in so much as you'll have to rely on whatever save functionality was available for the particular game that you're playing. Again, no save states, no rewinds or anything like that, you really do just have to sort of get good in a Soulsian fashion. See, I said I would tie that back together. And I got to learn this the hard way when I was playing Super Mario Land 2, the 6 golden coins on it, and I was kind of just playing recklessly in a way, and I was losing lives faster than I really noticed, and then I hit a game over screen, and then I didn't think much of it because I was like, it's a game over screen, it's a Mario game, who cares? But what I forgot was, in Super Mario Land 2, if you do hit a game over screen, then all of the boss coins that you've collected to open the final door disappear, and you have to go fight all of those bosses again, so yeah, lesson learned, I guess. It's not like the Chromatic goes out of its way to be hard just for the sake of being hard, but it also doesn't make any attempt whatsoever to soften the original experience either. And I have to say, as somebody who has historically really enjoyed emulating Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games, that the Modretro Chromatic really makes the cartridge experience feel premium again. Not just because it effortlessly plays your original Game Boy and Game Boy Color library, although that's very nice, but also because they've gone out of their way to provide a range of experiences for the Modretro Chromatic with actual Modretro Chromatic cartridges. And they have not spared any expense in making sure that each Modretro Chromatic release feels like the premium experience they want you to have on a device like this. Each Modretro release comes in a very high quality glossy cardboard box, and within each one you'll find the cartridge itself, which usually comes in a variety of colors and materials, from glow-in-the-dark to transparent to purple, orange, red, whatever. And then you'll also find a full color instruction booklet along with an actual charm that you can actually put onto your Modretro itself on the loops at the top that flank the cartridge slot. Now, personally, I haven't done this with any of the charms that I've collected yet because I don't want them banging into my screen or scratching the metal, even though it seems like it's a pretty durable system, but I still like collecting these little guys nonetheless, and I think it's really cool that they went above and beyond, not just to provide like the cartridge and the instruction manual, which were things we kind of expected back in the day, but then actually added another layer of collectability onto it. And pretty much every Modretro game that I've played so far has been incredibly fun, and none of these really feel like they're just phoning it in. Bunk and the Cursed cartridge is a particular high point. If you remember from a few months back, GameStop said they were releasing a Game Boy game, but it wasn't actually a Game Boy game, it was a Modretro Chromatic game, which you can play in original hardware if you'd like, but it is an incredibly fun platformer that just understands the fundamental mechanics of old 2D action platformers like that. But there are also like sprawling RPGs you can pick up for the system as well, like I've got Dragon Hymn playing back here on the monitor, and then I'm also playing an open world pirate rhythm game called Shanty, which has been very fun so far. But putting aside the fact that Modretro was not only committed to just recreating the Game Boy Color on its own terms, but also to reach out to a ton of indie developers to have them make new cartridges for the system, I have to say I'm really enjoying exploring all of the original cartridges that I had for the Game Boy. It's just been really fun recollecting for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color again, knowing that I kind of get to experience them in this new way. I mean, sure, I still have plenty of existing games in my collection to enjoy, but I also found myself just paying a lot more attention whenever I went out to local game shops at what they actually had to offer for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. And one game in particular I did want to highlight was Donkey Kong for the original Game Boy, which most people apparently refer to as Donkey Kong 94 because it's just so good and one of the better entries. Anytime I saw this cartridge out in the wild, I would immediately ignore it because I really just didn't have any interest in Donkey Kong if it wasn't Donkey Kong Country, but what I didn't realize about Donkey Kong 94 is it's barely a Donkey Kong game. At least not in the classic sense you might remember from the arcade. When you first start playing it, the first 4 levels are traditional Donkey Kong, but after those opening levels, the game kind of cracks wide open into not just being the traditional Donkey Kong experience, but really what we know in the modern age is the Mario vs. Donkey Kong experience, where you're basically just doing puzzle platforming levels over and over again in unique and interesting ways, and this game was way more fun than I thought it'd be, and it instantly became one of my favorite new Game Boy games. Well, new if you consider 32 years ago new, but you know what I mean. So while at first I thought the Modretro Chromatic might be like a slightly pricey passing novelty, it actually became one of my favorite systems, because now I'm constantly on the lookout for new Game Boy games, and I just have a renewed excitement about cartridges that wasn't really there before. I mean, I'm a physical collector, I'm always going to have some appreciation for those cartridges, but more often than not I would be looking for things for like the Nintendo, Super Nintendo, or obviously more recently the N64. So even though Game Boy and Game Boy Color games from like 30 years ago at this point might seem sort of quaint, just being kind of 8-bit relics of a time gone by, the Chromatic has done a lot to really reignite my love for that system in particular. But as much as I've enjoyed the device and its slavish commitment to authenticity, I don't love everything about it necessarily, and there are a few nitpicks that I could throw out there. For starters, it's definitely smaller and fits more in line with the original form factor of the Game Boy Color, which clearly is by design, and it's not inherently bad because it does make the system more pocketable, although ironically it does make it slightly less comfortable to hold than the analog Pocket, which is less pocketable now that I think about it. Now if you've got smaller hands, that might not be a huge deal, but if you've got larger hands or if you've gotten used to playing on larger handhelds, it might be a bit of an adjustment, and I was honestly kind of surprised by it the first time I picked it up. Also, even though I respect the commitment to the retro experience, it is going to be kind of a bummer for some people that this thing doesn't have save states. I mean, maybe they could add it at some point in the future, considering they do have the ability to do firmware updates, but I'm not holding my breath either. Also, it is kind of crazy to me that at $200 for the Gorilla Glass version or $300 for the Sapphire version, that it doesn't already come with a rechargeable battery inside. And finally, even though I appreciate what they've done with the screen on the Modretro Chromatic, that might not be to everyone's taste, because even though it is an incredible match for the original hardware, I think some people would rather play the idealized version of that hardware or what they remember in their head, which in many cases is obviously distorted, right? Now, speaking personally, again, I would not say this is the absolute best way to play Game Boy games, depending on what your definition of best is, right? Whether that means accurate to the experience or just whatever is most tailored to your specific gaming skill level and taste, but I will say that this is my favorite way to play Game Boy games right now. And I think the reason it's my favorite is because it seems to strike a perfect balance between modern feature sets with things like video out through USB-C, the ability to upgrade cartridges, the release of entirely new Game Boy games in 2026, but sticking to its retro roots as well by not doing things like offering save states or trying to make the screen something that it wasn't. And the other thing that I really have to hand it to Modretro for is the fact that they open sourced all of this. Their software, the schematics that you can download to 3D print, all of the components for this if you would like. Essentially, they set out to make the best Game Boy ever and then put their money where their mouth is by making it open source and saying, hey, if you think you can do it better, here is everything you would need to try that. And that is kind of unheard of. So at the end of the day, even though I like a lot of things about the Modretro Chromatic, I also realize that a lot of that is hugely biased because I'm somebody who grew up alongside the original Game Boy, and if you're in the same position where you also grew up alongside some of Nintendo's earliest portable efforts, I imagine you will very much be interested in the Modretro Chromatic. Not because it provides the most retina-searing way to reimagine your favorite titles of yesteryear, but because it truly respects that OG experience, and if that's something that matters to you, you should definitely check this out. Now, I've dropped links below where you can go check out the system and the games over on Modretro's site, and there's probably going to be a few affiliate links down there for accessories that I recommend after spending the past 4 to 6 weeks messing around with this device, but yeah, suffice it to say I'm having a great time with it, and I don't expect that will stop anytime soon. So, as always, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to watch videos here, I really appreciate it, take care, and I will see you on the next one.